Thank you so much for turning out tonight. This is a new venue for us, and I'm very pleased to see such a good house. I hope you'll feel that it was worth your while. Tonight I am going to speak on the topic of Nabby Hooper, a girl like no other, the early life and times of Abigail Hooper Trask of Manchester. Nabby Hooper, a girl and young woman of old Manchester and the early Republic, is the subject of this presentation. Her eventful adult life we will leave for another time. Here we are toward the end of 2022, on the eve of the bicentennial of her building of her own house, the only self-made woman in the state to have built her own residence. And we plan to offer programs and events associated with her life and that of the town throughout the year 2023. And when I say we, I mean the Manchester Historical Museum, of which I have recently become the director. Nabby Hooper once lived here and walked these same streets and saw many of the same sights we do. Her spirit is abroad today, for she was a modern person, a very modern person who lived in a not modern time. All the things that females now have as a birthright, she had to fight for. And she never got to vote, even though she was the leading banker of the town and the go-to person on many of the town's thorniest municipal issues. Nabby truly was one in a million. She was born in Manchester in 1788, and for all of her 97 years, there was no one else like her here. And there was probably no one else like her in Massachusetts, for alone among women, she saw herself clearly as an individual, a human being who happened to be female and who was not daunted by the constraints and expectations that kept women from pursuing a career in a world that really did not want them doing that. Nabby was born just as the United States Constitution was ratified, without any civil rights for females. At that time, the basic unit of society was the household and not the individual. Each household had a male head, regarded by the law as the ruler of his own little fiefdom. Women were dependent parts of the household, subordinate to husbands and fathers, and denied a voice in running their own affairs or those of the community. Among males, there were no dissenting voices to this vast discrimination based on the accident of birth, all except the editors of the Massachusetts Magazine, who in March 1790 published the work of the first American woman ever to argue publicly for the equality of the sexes. It is no small irony that during Nabby's earliest childhood, this original plea for the equality of women was made by Judith Sargent Murray, a native and resident of Gloucester. Soon, she would move to Boston and pursue a career as a writer and as an advocate for the religious sect of Universalism. But pleas for equality would go unheard in the new nation. Here is the portrait of the woman, Mrs. Abigail Trask, who was once the girl Nabby Hooper of Kettle Cove, Manchester. This is not the portrait of a pleader. She wants to be seen as the town's leading business person, running the department store that she has built from scratch. She deals in everything that a household might want or need: fabrics, lace, ribbons, bonnets, hats, booze, wine and beer, groceries and meat, dyes, boots and shoes, candles, buttons, yarn, rope, tobacco, and more, including opium. As you can see, she expects you to pay promptly. It is a remarkable picture, full of symbolism. She is not trying to win a beauty contest. She is a 35-year-old trader in goods, regarding you from across the counter of supply and demand, and she is looking for a profit through those spectacles. Probably no other woman had her portrait painted with glasses on. Is there a hint of a smile? Has another male shopkeeper just gone out of business, unable to compete with her? She models one of the bonnets that she makes and sells by the dozens, and she wears a mourning pin in memory of someone who has died, and she will sell you crepe, ribbon, and rum for the funeral. Her time is valuable, and so she wears a watch with a fob, again, unusual for a woman's portrait, and she holds a quill pen for keeping her handwritten and poorly spelled account books. This busy and formidable woman has never married and has, as an adult, devoted herself to making money through retailing in the tiny town of Manchester. Of course, it was not always so. Once she was a little girl, a daughter and a sister, growing up in a family and in a village within the town. Nabby Hooper, as she was christened, was born on October 5th, 1788, the daughter of Joseph Hooper, a farmer, and his wife, Nabby Crafts. She was their second child after son Joseph Jr. was born 2 years before in April of 1786. Nabby was the usual nickname for Abigail in Manchester. Her mother was always known as Nabby too, not Abigail or Abby. She had married in 1785 Joseph Hooper. Both were from Manchester, but from different villages, Kettle Cove and the middle section. So, for those of you not from Manchester, Kettle Cove still forms the extreme easterly part of the town, and the middle section is what is now considered downtown, but it was never called that in those days. So here is an early map of Essex County, and let's see if we can find tiny, old, hidden Manchester. At the time of Nabby's birth, it was the fourth smallest town in Essex County, lying between important places like the seaports of Beverly and Gloucester, with roads so bad that most people got from place to place in rowboats and small sloops. Here is the town itself. made up of 4 distinct, dispersed villages. It was a town of villages. This is taken from a map of Manchester made 40 years after Nabby's birth. It's the earliest map, though. It's from 1830, and it's the first to show the topographic details of the town. So as you look to the right, you are looking at Kettle Cove, which is the village where Nabby's family had lived for at least 3 generations. Her grandfather was still alive, Jacob Hooper. Her father was Joseph Hooper. And there were about 100 people living in Kettle Cove at that time. And then on the way back to the harbor, which is sort of to the center left, there was another village, entirely different, called North Yarmouth, which is now Forest Street, and most of those houses are gone. But it was a distinct village within Manchester. And then there was the middle section, which is downtown today, and nearly as big as the middle section on the Beverly line was the part of town, the 4th village, called Newport. So not only was the town separated into various villages, but people's primary identities came from those villages, these different names of villages. At the time of Nabby's birth in 1788, Manchester was a very small fishing town. Primarily, it made its money through men and boys shipping out onto the banks off Nova Scotia 4 or 5 schooners owned in town, and 3 times as many men and boys working in the fish yards to cure the fish. It had a total of 142 houses, many of them dating from the 1600s at that point, and what we might consider extremely modest places, 196 families, and a population of 965 souls. Of them, 438 were male, 234 of working age, and 518 were female. That 80-person difference shows you the impact of the high mortality of seafaring. Manchester had the nickname beyond its boundaries of the Little City. Most of its men and boys were employed in the cod fishery, as I say, but others were merchant mariners sailing out of Boston for shipping merchants. At that time, Whittier's or Foster's Cove, around from Tuck's Point, was the center of the local salt cod fishery. It was run by Samuel Forster, who owned a few small schooners whose men sailed out to the banks of Nova Scotia to catch tons of cod at a time, sometimes staying out for 3 months at a stretch. Returning, the fish was laid out on Forster's fish flakes to be dried out and then sold to merchants in Salem and Boston for shipment overseas on freighters. Manchester had no shipping merchants because in those days it had no harbor. Beyond Norton's Point, it was all just a big salt marsh and clam flat, not navigable except at high tide. It would be dredged out in another 100 years. So this is the central topographical fact that set the destiny for Manchester. Had it had the kind of harbor that it has today, it would have become a commercial seaport. But here you see a view from Spy Rock Hill before 1893, showing you that the harbor was in fact a landform in those days. The typical freighter of the time that would carry away the fish and that came from a different place like Salem or Marblehead or Boston was a two-masted brig, though there were three-masted ships as well, all owned by the merchants of the seaports, men engaged in importing and exporting. If they were successful, they would become wealthy, but the Manchester sailors on their vessels did not make much money unless they became shipmasters, which most did not. So it was a poor town. Joseph Hooper, Nabby's dad, was a yeoman or crop farmer. He worked a fair amount of land at Kettle Cove, and he had bought most of his father's house. It stood above the cove, which was usually a busy place with small vessels being built and sawmills at work, and men and boys curing fish in the fish yards. Nabby's mother, Nabby Crafts Hooper, was the daughter of Eleazar Crafts and Elizabeth Allen. Eleazar was the town's highest-ranking soldier as Major Crafts during the Revolutionary War, and afterward he ran a tavern, a sort of hotel and restaurant, which stood in front of the meeting house, in front of what is now the 1809 First Parish Church, the center of religious and civic life, with a sizable store next door to the tavern. And this is an old photo of that store, no longer standing, nor is the Crafts House standing there, but in this very central location downtown was where the Crafts lived and did their business. And so Nabby was connected to that as well. Nabby's matrilineal connection was very strong. Her grandmother, Elizabeth, had been a shopkeeper with her first husband and was a young widow when she married Major Crafts. She was an industrious maker of shirts for soldiers all throughout the Revolutionary War and had her daughter Nabby, our Nabby's mom, working with her every day. The unusual combination of shopkeeping, shirt making, and tavern keeping in the center of town would be Nabby's legacy as the only daughter in her family. But not right away. As a child, Nabby's family lived in Kettle Cove, and she would have observed her mother and her mother's teenage female helpers engaged fully in domestic duties, making and baking bread, working the loom to make homespun cloth, attending to the dye pot with all of its fragrances, cleaning everything every day, cooking every meal in the fireplace, minding the children, and operating the spinning wheel with its busy hum. In the spring of 1793, when Nabby was 4, a terrible epidemic of typhoid hit Manchester. Every family was afflicted by this disease, and dozens of people died right away. It persisted for nearly 2 years, unique to this town, which built 2 small sanitariums, or as they called them, pest houses, in remote areas. The new minister, young Reverend Ariel Parrish, was among the first to die. No doctors or nurses outside of Manchester would come into this town. In September 1793, Eleazar Crafts, 50, died of the town plague, and a year later, in October of 1794, Joseph Hooper, at 33, died, and in November, his mother, Mrs. Anna Lee Hooper, 64, also died. Thus, the epidemic deprived Nabby and her three little brothers of their father, their maternal grandmother, and their paternal grandmother. This plague finally ended by 1795. It is likely that Nabby's widowed mother moved her family into the town center at this time, perhaps to live with her widowed mother and with her brother, Captain David Crafts, a shipmaster who had lost his wife to the epidemic and had the care of a child. He was now engaged to marry Anna Forster, a daughter of the codfish tycoon, Captain Samuel Forster. In 1798, Mrs. Nabby Crafts Hooper married again. Her new husband was a mariner, Stephen Smith, who had come from New Hampshire. They returned to the house in Kettle Cove, where they would start a new family of Smith children, Nabby's half-siblings. By 1800, Nabby's older brother, Joseph Hooper, 14, had become a cordwainer or shoemaker and had moved back to the town center, probably to live with his Crafts relatives. In 1801, their grandfather, Jacob Hooper, died, and the children inherited a fair amount of property at Kettle Cove and on what is now Central Street. Kettle Cove had its own little school where the children would be instructed until the age of 13 or so, after which most of the boys would be apprenticed into a trade or given a berth on a vessel. In 1801, Nabby came to the end of her education and faced the common lot of females: to work as servants and spend years doing domestic chores. They had no other destiny in early America, no careers, and no hope of one. They were expected to work as maids until they were 19 or 20, and then marry a young sailor or fisherman and become a homemaker for him and their children. Poised on the brink of this fate, Nabby Hooper refused to proceed. She could not imagine a life of drudgery any more than she could think of marriage and a lifetime of dependence and subservience as the reward for her teenage servitude. No doubt she had got a taste of it in helping her mother with the care of a number of new little Smiths. She watched some of the boys in her neighborhood getting placed into trades in the big town of Gloucester, and she persuaded her mother to let her follow suit. Her mother recognized in Nabby her own spirit of self-reliance and ambition, and so Nabby Hooper, alone of all Manchester girls, escaped. She went to work as a counter girl and seamstress at a Gloucester fabric store, known then as a dry goods shop. Like other apprentices, she lived in the family of her master or mistress in Gloucester, then a prospering commercial seaport, as well as a center of the cod fishery. She left behind her two younger brothers, Jacob, 10, and Eleazar, 8, and the little Smiths. In the fabric store, she became proficient as a bonnet maker and had the chance to observe the ins and outs of running a business. Perhaps she was eventually entrusted with keeping the waste book and the customer accounts, for she had a good head for math and accounting. She signed off on the sales of family land in 1805 and 1808, by which time she was no longer working in Gloucester. In March of 1808, she purchased for $65 a 2-room condo in Kettle Cove in the house of Molly Morgan with a piece of land belonging. In the paperwork, she was called a Manchester spinster, a standard legal term for an unmarried or single woman. The condo may have been an investment, or she may have lived there for a while. 1808 would have been the year for 20-year-old Nabby to marry. No doubt she reconnected with family members after her work in Gloucester, and she may have had suitors. But whatever her attitude to Manchester and its expectations for young women, Nabby had her own plans. And she soon made them public by opening a store in which she sold the bonnets she made. Nabby was a devout person and would remain so for life. With the rest of Manchester, she was proud when in 1809, the town's first parish, and the whole town had just gone through the privations of Jefferson's embargo, came together to build this noble building as the meeting house of the religious society, as well as the place for the men to hold their town meetings. In 1813, Nabby was termed a milliner, or women's hat maker, when she joined others in selling land. Her work had given her an identity as one who had made her own living, apart from the norms of society and the control of and dependence on men. Those men, by the way, were then caught up in an unpopular war against the British, in which Manchester males participated almost exclusively as privateers. In fact, Nabby was much more than a milliner. She was a dealer in cloth in competition with men. She sold fabrics, both imported and factory-made, broadcloth, cashmere, calicos, silks, bombazettas, Indian cottons, ginghams, flannels, cambrics, and dimities. She was evidently something of a merchant tailor. She made vests, among other things, for few of these materials were used in fashioning bonnets. We know about her store and some of its contents only because one night in the summer of 1813, she was robbed of all those things, and also of $30 and her purse. And she placed an ad in a Boston newspaper offering a $50 reward for the thieves and goods, and $30 for the goods alone. Nabby was not to be dissuaded by this disaster. In June of 1814, if not before, she was back in business. Her store may have been in the downtown building owned by her grandmother, Elizabeth Allen Craft, herself once a shopkeeper. We know about her retail operations because your museum has her 1814 account book and her books of business for many years after. And in case you can't see it, this is the first leaf of the 1814 account book. And at the very top, she has written in her name, Nabby. So at this point, having mentioned the account book, I want to introduce Matthew Swindell, who is one of our staffers, a graduate student at Salem State, and who has done a great deal of work in trying to extract from these poorly written and poorly spelled books some information that would be helpful for us to know as to exactly what it was that Nabby Hooper was up to in this retail business. So Matthew's going to spend 3 minutes or so up here at this microphone, and then we will be done.
So here we go, looking into her ledger. All right, can you hear me? All right. So in a 2-week period, in June 1814, in the later part of the month, she had 34 different customers, one of whom, Jacob Kitfield, he dies on the 18th, and his widow Anna buys crepe, silk, and ribbon for the funeral, paying in barter by making a clock for Nabby. Now she makes her profits through both cash and barter, cash one being those Spanish reals like you see up there. So she must keep an adept calculator of value. Many customers come from Kettle Cove. Now, some customers, like Captain Nehemiah Ingersoll, make multiple purchases in June. There's 2 pounds of coffee, then a gallon of rum, and then a half pint of Stoughton's Elixir, also known as the Great Stomach Elixir, which is mainly brandy. The captain was a retired Boston merchant who had built a fine mansion at Kettle Cove. Another returning customer you see on the top there is Mrs. Elizabeth Woodwire, the 39-year-old widow of a Newburyport merchant who would herself die in New Orleans in another 5 years. Now, Nabby's handwriting and spelling can be a challenge to the reader. See what you think up there. Now, on July 1st, 1814, Nabby, she has transactions with old lady Elizabeth Crafts, a.k.a. her grandmother, who receives a cash certificate. Mrs. Lucretia Story, she buys a yard of cambric cloth. Mr. John Bohannon, he purchases a bunch of cigars. Mrs. Wire, she loads up on West Indies rum, and she gets some paregoric, too, to go with it. And Miss Sally Goldsmith, she buys 2 pairs of shoes and 2 yards of tassel. All right, and I'll turn you back now over to Bob.
Matthew Swindell. So, in March of 1814, Nabby had her 26th birthday. Likely, she was living at Kettle Cove and had her store there, but her ambitions were taking her elsewhere. Toward the end of the war, in the spring of 1815, she and 2 of her brothers sold a large tract of Hooper agricultural land at Kettle Cove and moved into the town. They bought a house together on North Street. No closer to marrying, Nabby, now identified in legal documents as a trader, which usually meant a grocer in those days, started up a new store then, one that would make her rich, and 8 years later, enable her to take the unprecedented step for a woman of building a house for herself. That future person, known as Abigail, would be leaving behind her life as Nabby Hooper, Manchester's amazing girl like no other. Thank you.